everyone. The topic that I'm going to start today is tributary system. In many academic circles, this system is also known as the Nazrana system. It is one of the most important concepts to understand China's relation with the external world, particularly other countries. In this lecture, I will talk about the concept of tributary relation, its meaning, and how it worked. Then I will discuss about how the system was carried out and how it worked. Lastly, I'll discuss about how the system gradually came to an end. Tributary system is a term which often causes academic problems, particularly in relation with Western usages and practice. It is very difficult to find a modern Western equivalent of this term because traditional institutions of China are very difficult to understand in comparison to Western ideas. There is no equivalent Chinese term to understand tributary system, and one has to rely on Western usages for its description and analysis. This is because Confucian scholarship did not conceive tributary system as an institution independent of other Confucian institution, and so it did not have a distinct character as such. To understand the concept of tributary system, one has to understand why the system was so important and how it affected the Chinese polity. To understand Chinese polity, we have to first understand the position of the emperor. In Chinese polity, the emperor was not only the political and temporal head of the state, but was also a figure who acted as mediator between heaven and earth. Thus, the rituals he performed are not only for China, but were for universal usage. He was considered tien, that is son of heaven, and so he performed the rites and rituals so that he can maintain the harmony of heaven and the universe as such. He was also considered as huang-ti, or emperor, who was at the top of the civilized world. Thus, it was considered natural that presentation of tributes to the emperor is essential for maintaining the harmony of the universe. Historian Mark Mankel believes that presentation of tribute to the emperor meant that acknowledging to the world that the world is going on in its own rhythm and the emperor is making it so. Entry to the emperor's present or court required recognition of these principles and the correct performance of these rituals and tribute presentation. Refusal to perform these rituals meant not only an insult to the emperor, but also destabilizing the harmony that exists in the universe. Foreigners who did not perform these rituals were not permitted to enter into the presence of the emperor. This is something that the Western powers could never understand. Historian Emmanuel Shu is of the view that the Qing dynasty was weakened by internal problems, but still it was kept going up the face of the great empire, and it cherished the glory of its former days through rituals like the tributary ritual. It clung to the notion that China is the middle kingdom of the universe and the earth, and it was the center of the known civilization. And all the countries who desired to have a healthy relation or any sort of relationship with China must accept its tributary status. The Confucian worldview gave rise to some differences between Western and traditional diplomatic practices. For example, in the West, an ambassador was considered as not only a representative of his master, but also he partook the master's official personality when dealing with some other foreign powers. In Asiatic countries, particularly in China, the situation was not so. The ambassador was fundamentally only a messenger carrying the wishes of the emperors in letter. Tribute relationship was thus an extension of China's civilization in the realm beyond the immediate power of the emperor. To understand the tributary concept in greater detail and depth, we have to understand the concept known as sinocentrism. China, because of its excellence in culture, economy, and military, and because of its vast territorial expanse, stood in a very preeminent position in East Asia for the previous 2 millennia. Emmanuel Shu says that since early Ming period, there had been instituted a hierarchical system of international relations in East and Southeast Asia, with China occupying the leadership role and other countries like Korea, Liuchu or Ryukyu, Annam or Vietnam, Siam, Burma, and other peripheral states of Southeast Asia and East Asia assuming the position of junior members. It was a China-centered community of nations. This theory was based on the Confucian notion that just like every individual in society has a particular status and position, similarly, in the international system, every state in the universe has its particular station in relation to China. The basic principle underlying this China-centric community of nation was inequality of status as compared to China and also in compared to each other. And no relation between members were to be governed and without the sanction of the tributary system. So any country entering into relation with China should have to go through the tributary relation and tributary status. This concept was little understood by the Western powers who believe in diplomatic relations of equality, and this led to the friction between the relationship between China and the Western power. Let us now pause for a quiz. The question is, according to Confucian philosophy, China considered itself, number 1, ruler of the universe, number 2, ruler of the cosmos, number 3, Middle Kingdom, and number 4, Asiatic emperor. The answer is option 3, that is Middle Kingdom. The tribute relation was always bilateral and never multilateral. On the one part was the foreign country or the country which wanted to establish relationship with the China, and on the other side, the permanence of the emperor of China. The tributary system was modeled on the feudal Chinese practice, whereby the emperor invested, called feng, and the feudal lords and vassals, called fan, both inside and outside China, and received in return their offerings through local products called fangfu as tribute or kung, which in actuality was a modified form of tax payment. Now let us turn to the working of the tributary system. During the Ming period, tributary relations were supervised by the Board of Rites of the Reception Committee or the department, while relations with certain specified countries were managed by the Board of War. After the kings established their power, they refined this system and established an office of foreign relations, particularly with Mongolia, called the Li Fan Yuan or Barbarian Control Office. The kings established their capital at Peking, and there they made Li Fan Yuan an integral part of the tribute system, and it used the rites and forms of the Confucian tradition in the Chinese system to conduct relations with barbarians, that is, countries which were outside the pale of Chinese civilization. During the Qing times, therefore, there were two tribute offices that existed. One, the Board of Right, and the other was the Li Fan Yuan. This jurisdiction did not overlap due to their geographical responsibilities. Historian Mark Mankel believes the societies of East and Southeast Asia were included within the jurisdiction of the Board of Rites, which was itself in charge of maintaining the Confucian rites and rituals, and it transmitted Confucian culture. These regions were thus considered an extension of China, though it was immediately outside the control of the emperor. The societies of northwest China were under the jurisdiction of the Li Fan Yuan, whose sole function was only to construct and held intercourse between these tribal countries or societies and the kings. It is believed that economically China wanted separate relation with the Southeast Asian countries, which were primarily agriculture, and the nomadic northwest countries. During the Qing period, the tributary rituals became highly ritualistic, with clearly defined rights and duties on the part of each participant. The role of China was to maintain peace and harmony in Southeast Asia. It recognized the legitimacy of the tributary kings by sending envoys to officiate their investitures. During times of foreign invasion or natural calamities, China sent relief missions to these countries to help them. On the part of the tributary countries, they honored the superior status of China by sending periodic tribute missions to China and requesting the investiture of their kings. They also adopted the Chinese calendar. The size, the frequency, and the route of tributary mission were fixed by China. It was usually the policy that the closer the country with China and the closer the relationship with China, the larger and the more frequent will be the tribute mission. For example, Korea paid 4 times a year the tribute, presenting all of it at the end of each year. Liu Chu presented tribute twice every 3 years, Annam once every 2 years, and Siam every 3 years, whereas Laos and Burma every 10 years. Now, what happened when these tribute missions reached China? All travel expenses, maintenance of the mission in China were borne by the Chinese when they were inside China and by the Chinese government. When they arrived in Peking, the members were lodged in a common residence of tributary envoys called the Hui Tung Sui Kuan. A special day was chosen according to the astrological calendar that the Chinese consulted, and the envoys were to present their tribute on that special day. They would produce the local products to the Chinese emperor. During the presentation of this, there was a ritual called the Cow Tao, which was a ceremony by which 3 kneelings and 9 knockings on the head on the floor before the Chinese emperor had to be conducted. Trade and tributary relations are interlinked together. Both are very much important when we have to understand the working of the tributary system. Trade followed immediately upon the presentation of tribute to the emperor at the capital. Tribute missions were accompanied by merchants who were permitted to trade duty-free at Peking for a specified number of days. The commercial transaction was highly profitable for the tributary mission, as the emperor showed his benevolence by bestowing handsome gifts not only to the tributary kings but also to all the persons who had accompanied the mission. The objects offered in the tribute or received as gifts were often rare and commanded a high price in the market, not only inside China but also in the tributary countries. And this was special because of the fact that the gifts that these envoys received were chosen by the imperial household. For this reason only, its commercial values increased manyfold. Mark Mankel believes that trade and tribute were related aspects of a process of exchange that included not only tribute goods and things of economic value, but political recognition and military aid, courtesies, entertainments, performance by women, and of course, grand feasts. All these exchanges were meant for groups and not individuals, and all these groups were intermingled through mutual obligations. Let us now turn to a quiz. The question is, the cost of the tributary mission in China was borne by number 1, China, number 2, the tributary country, number 3, both parties, and number 4, special office created for this purpose. The answer is option 1, that is China. Tributary relations were very costly to maintain, particularly for the tributary countries. The dispatch of a mission to China was a very difficult task. For example, Korea, which is almost 750 miles away from Peking, for them to prepare a mission of 200 to 300 people and moving them at such a huge distance required 40 to 60 days. Even more expensive was when the Chinese investiture mission happened. China sent their envoys to investiture mission to only 3 states, Korea, Liujiu, and Annam. The imperial investiture mission consisted of almost 500 to 600 people. They used to stay in the capital of the tributary country for almost 5 to 6 months. And this often caused a heavy strain in the part of the tributary country, especially if it is a small country like Liujiu. Emmanuel Shu thinks that the reason why the tributary kings accepted this difficulty of sending tributary mission, accepting investiture mission, and accepted the whole tributary system was more than pure economic motivation. For the tributary kings, the investiture legitimized his rule, raised his prestige before his people, offered him protection in times of foreign invasion and aid during times of natural disasters, and brought him luxury articles from the Chinese emperor himself. It heightened the cultural links between his country and China and allowed him to conduct profitable trade with the Middle Kingdom. For the Chinese emperor, it was an immense pleasure and satisfaction too to see that his overlordship is acknowledged and celebrated by neighboring countries. And these countries acted as the outer fence for Chinese defense against barbarian attacks. Tributary relations were thus primarily maintained to permit Confucian concept of propriety and to affirm the hierarchical world order in which China was assumed as a very, very superior power, superior status, and ensured security for China. Now let us see how the Western countries reacted to this tributary relation and the system. When China encountered the Western world, a problem of understanding regarding this concept arose. The kings insisted that the tributary system not only applied to neighboring countries but also to countries who wanted to establish any sort of relationship with China, even if it was only related to trade. During the heydays of the kings, envoys from Western countries like Portugal and Russia and Netherlands not only came to China as tribute missions, but their envoys also had to perform the kowtow before the Chinese emperor. Emmanuel Shu believes that although Russia and the Western countries were not formally included in the tributary system, the Chinese treated these missions as though they were tribute mission. To account for the sporadic nature of these missions, it was explained to the Chinese world by the king court and its scholars and scribes that since there was a great distance between China and the Western world, that is why these tribute missions had no fixed schedules, and bringing tributes to China did not follow any particular rule. This worked as a perfect face-saving mechanism for the kings. Historian J.K. Fairbank believes that between 1655 and 1795, as many as 17 missions, which were official in nature, were sent to China, and all but only one yielded to the Chinese demand of performing kowtow before the emperor. It is only the mission of Lord Macartney whereby he refused to perform the kowtow. Qing policy towards the missions from foreign countries was thus very, very strict, but its attitude towards private traders were more flexible and accommodating. Private traders did not require to send any official correspondence with the government because they conducted their affairs through the government-appointed monopolistic traders who were called hongs. But only they were subjected to a lot of restrictive regulations, particularly in relation to their movement and trade procedures. Unlike Europe, the formal parity of all sovereign nations had been acknowledged since the 17th century, and the balance of power prevented the emergence of a continental empire. In China, a neo-Confucian state system of international relations reinforced the impossibility of international relations and relationship or intercourse based on terms of legal equality. Indeed, whoever wished to enter into any sort of diplomatic or commercial relation with China was expected to be Chinese vassal, and officially they had to accept the hegemony of the Chinese emperor. By the early 19th century, both the governments and the private traders of the Western countries started clashing in respect to the tribute system. The Western powers were unwilling to accept the tribute system. The latter insisted on international relations and international norms based on law, diplomacy, and equality that existed in Europe. China refused. The clash ultimately culminated to the Opium War, though this was not the only reason. Many other factors, primarily opium trade, was a major factor behind the Opium Wars. Emanuel Schuh says that by the time the West made a concerted effort to break down the Chinese institution of foreign relations, the tributary system had already worn itself out to a large extent. Since the middle of the 18th century, it was exposed to two disruptive forces. Number one, the rise of the Chinese junk trade with Southeast Asia, and number two, the growth of the European trade in Canton. These both were outside the range of the tributary system. Hundreds of Chinese junk sailed to Malay Peninsula, Siam, Annam, Java, Sumatra to negotiate their own business. Many of the tributary states in these areas found that they no longer needed to support the tributary system to get along and to establish commercial relations with China. Thus, they stopped sending tributary missions to China. The independent European trade between private traders and also between some of the companies of the various Western countries had permitted, and they were allowed to trade from the region or the port of Canton. It also was a major disruptive force that gradually led to the breakdown of the tribute system. After the Opium Wars, which happened in two phases, the first Opium War from 1840 to 42 and the second one from 1856 to 60, China was gradually reduced to a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society due to the aggression of Western powers and also of Japan. As its national strength fell, the Qing dynasty also were plunged into political instability. With its decline in its power and prestige in East Asia, it was very difficult to maintain a tribute mission. Consequently, its tributaries also, all the countries which were once tributary countries of China, came into the orbits of Western power and also of Japan due to colonial expansion. These changes were also caused by the colonization of some of the protectorates of the West, especially in the 20th century. In 1895, the Qing forces were defeated in the First Sino-Japanese War, and the imperial court was forced to sign a humiliating and costly treaty known as the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Ultimately, these developments brought about the deterioration and eventual demise of the tribute system. So, we are coming to the final quiz. The question is, the tribute system came to an end because, number one, the rise of Chinese junk trade with Southeast Asia. Number two, the growth of foreign trade centering around Canton. And number three, the defeat of China in the First Sino-Japanese War. And number four, all of the above. The answer is option number 4, all of the above. Let us now make a quick summary of whatever we have discussed till now. The tribute system, or the system known as the tributary, was the traditional Chinese system for managing its foreign relations. By establishing rules and controlling the means of symbolic forms by which foreign countries entered and conducted their relations with China, the Chinese found in the tributary system an effective mechanism for extracting compliance from its neighboring states and also people on important matters of political, defensive, economic, and diplomatic concern of China. Confucianism was the dominant Chinese philosophy for many centuries, and this philosophy argued that a society should be organized on hierarchical lines, while the emperor performed the role of the father to his people. In Chinese polity, the emperor was not only the temporal head, but was also a figurehead who acted as a mediator between the heaven and the earth. Thus, the rituals he performed were not only for the benefit of China, but also had a universal value. Entry to the emperor's presence or court required recognition of these principles through the correct performance of the rituals and tribute presentation. Refusal to perform these rituals meant not only an insult to the emperor, but also destabilizing a relationship of harmony that was possible because of the emperor's presence in the universe. Foreigners who did not perform the rituals could not be permitted in the presence of the emperor. This is something that the Western power could never understand because they believed in equal diplomatic relationship between two sovereign countries. But China always insisted that if you have to maintain any sort of relationship, whether defensive, economic, or diplomatic, you have to accept Chinese suzerainty and accept the Chinese emperor as your hegemonic head. After the Opium War of 1840-42 and 1856 to 1860, China was gradually reduced to a semi-colonial and semi-feudal state due to the aggression of the Western powers and also of Japan. As its national strength fell, the Qing dynasty was plagued with political instability. In 1895, the Qing forces were defeated by the Japanese forces in the First Sino-Japanese War, and ultimately the imperial court signed the humiliating treaty called the Treaty of Shimonoseki. All these developments gradually led to the deterioration and the eventual demise of the tribute system. Thank you.